22nd of June 1941, the Germans invaded Russia. By August, they had driven deep into Soviet territory, and Hitler's death squads had systematically killed tens of thousands of Jews and communist officials. But Russian resistance was growing. Ordered by Stalin not to let the invaders get their hands on anything useful, civilians were forced to destroy crops, equipment, and even their homes. The Germans were pushing the front line forward so fast that many Russians had no time to retreat, but were overtaken and left behind, trapped in conquered territory. However, the Germans hadn't counted on the character of ordinary Red Army soldiers, who tended to fight on, long after their Western counterparts might have surrendered. The combat was barbaric and relentless, and even the weather seemed to be against the invaders.
We had in August 41, a period of continuous rain, which led to smaller rivers bursting their banks, and this made fighting a lot harder, because you could not go underground. If you dug a hole, it would immediately fill with water. But this was only temporary, for about a week, very uncomfortable. Later on, during the advance and in the battles of Russia, we didn't really have any problem, as long as we were not in the forests. The Russians were always attacking in the forests, and the difficulty during the forest fighting was to keep a sense of context, for them as well as for us. The only difference was the Russians deployed many more men than we did.
Army Group South had been sent reinforcements and was planning to take Kiev, capital of the Ukraine. By August 1941, the Germans had begun to surround the city. Lacking the hardware to resist the German assault, the Soviet hierarchy resorted to its one limitless resource, manpower. Wave after wave of Russians was sent into the German line of fire. Many were untrained, some were unarmed.
We were then supposed to complete the encirclement of Kiev in the east from behind, and this was very, very heavy fighting. The Russians were making desperate attempts to break out, and at the same time were trying to break up this German encirclement from the outside with new units to the east. It was a hard battle. We were firing the guns directly into these waves of attacking Russians. It was terrible what happened there. And then afterwards, we had these vast columns of thousands of prisoners who marched past us, and there were a few German sentries among them. And this made a big impression on us. And we saw again and again these raw conscript companies who were being used one wave after the other, and they suffered terrible losses, truly frightful losses, because they were badly trained and poorly armed as well. Often the logistics would break down completely. We got nothing to eat and had to go and get a few potatoes and such things from the peasants because the supplies simply didn't arrive. There were always bottlenecks in the fuel supply as well. The tanks needed incredible quantities of fuel. And once they had advanced 100 kilometers, then they really needed new supplies, otherwise the whole thing would simply grind to a halt. Der Nachschub kommen, sonst stand die Sache. We also faced the difficulty of the fact that an undeveloped country such as Russia was at that time was of course much more difficult for motorized warfare than it was in France with their superb road system, where you could travel 100 kilometers a day. You couldn't do that here.
Aber das war dann also ich würde sagen, der Vorteil, dass einfach die...
But that was the advantage of being short of supplies, because there had to be a period of rest.
Musste zum Teil eben auch durch den unmöglichen Straßenzustand.
The rapid advance of the Germans began to slow. Hitler had underestimated not only Russian determination, but the immensity of the Soviet Union. And despite the efficiency of the German onslaught, at the end of August, the Russians were still hanging on to Kiev. Stalin's ruthless orders sent many of his own countrymen to their deaths. In German-occupied Russia, Hitler's Einsatzgruppen, extermination squads, systematically slaughtered Jews. In German-occupied France, the Jews hadn't been hounded so ferociously. But with France's puppet government in Vichy spreading Nazi propaganda, persecution of the Jews was widespread nevertheless.
When there were queues for the shops, there were also many anti-Semitic remarks, because the French, not all the time, but quite often said that it was the Jews who were eating up all their bread, that the rationing was our fault, the whole war, because you must remember that German propaganda was very effective then, that all the problems, the Jews were to blame for everything.
For example, if we wanted to go to a cafe for a drink or to use the toilet, it was forbidden. There were notices everywhere saying, "No Jews." One well-known cafe still exists, DuPont. I have to mention it because there are many photos of the signs that were in it, which said, "No dogs or Jews." It was decreed that they had to be under non-Jewish management, so it was instigated, and the manager had to be Aryan, and Aryan means non-Jewish.